By special arrangement with the producer and the distributor, Hakushin Audiovisual Limited have the pleasure in presenting for your entertainment
Now it's time for Cult Bin Corner. As regular listeners will know, it's where I go over to Mr. Tim Worthington, who should be in our Liverpool studios.
Hello.
See, he's gold.
Hello, brackets Liverpool.
So, what have you brought for Cult Bin Corner this week? Here's a small audio teaser.
I hear a new world. Calling me. So strange and so real.
What was that, Tim?
Well, as you might have gathered, today's bin actually is a bin from space, because that was a bit of I Hear a New World, which is an album by a very famous British record producer of the 60s called Meek, who was better known for, obviously, for producing other people like the Honeycombs and the Tornadoes, and of course Hines, who did Just Like Eddie. Well, we'll come back to sort of what his forte as a producer was in a minute, but he was always very interested in making sort of themed kind of early concept albums where the concept was a sound rather than, lyrical, where he was trying to sort of evoke things like he did one about the Wild West and so on. But this one was I Hear a New World, which is his vision of what music from space might sound like. And it was recorded, I think it was recorded very late in 1959, and a couple of tracks came out at the time, which again we'll come back to, but the full album hasn't actually been available until recently.
So, Joe Meek, for those who aren't aware, what would be the most famous records that he put in the charts?
Well, probably there's What Do You Want to Make Those Eyes at Me For by Emil Ford and the Checkmates, which I think might be in his first major hit. Have I the Right by the Honeycombs, which is number one. Telstar by the Tornadoes, which is number one. But obviously they're all very well-known records. And
Telstar was the first British number one in America.
It was indeed, and they all had a very distinctive sound. The studio sort of actually in his flat, not even his house, his flat, and they were all recorded in the front room and the bathroom and so on. And he's very into enhancing records with appropriate sound effects.
So he's very influential, but guess this album, with it not being released, didn't exactly tickle anyone's particular interest at the time in a record company sense.
Well, not at all, no. There was an EP released of, I think, 4 or 5 tracks from it, which sold next to nothing, and I think got one review somewhere, and because of that, it was shelved, basically. It never came out.
Yeah.
And to be honest, he was a very, very unstable chap at the best of times, but legend has it that the failure of I Hear a New World to appear did quite a lot of damage to him.
Oh, right. Quite what he was expecting. When did this come out?
It would have come out, I think, very early in 1960 or late 1959.
So he's actually quite surprised that something so, what is clearly unusual, didn't strike a chord.
Well, yeah, he clearly thought it was, going to be quite a big thing. You can kind of see where he's coming from when you bear in mind that was the age of, sort of the stereo sampler LPs when stereos were just coming in. And, there was all this sort of exotic demonstration music. And it's kind of in a similar vein to that, but literally orbiting in its own universe. So, yeah, I mean, obviously there were people doing their own sort of sonic experimentation before the Beatles started. Well, there was George Martin, for example, and there were people like Johnny Dankworth and so on, but Joe Meek was really the one who really pushed it. But unfortunately, he was a little bit bonkers as well, and he, as you suggest, he didn't really sense that his wilder ideas might not have enormous commercial potential. I mean, you just have to look at some of the titles on this album of, these sort of, well, they're kind of rickety skiffle instrumentals, but with very weird sounds.
sorry, rickety skiffle. That is my favourite character from the Moomins or Heidi, or fill in as appropriate. Rickety skiffle. Are they on the Enemy tour this year?
You wonder who he expected to pick it up and buy it. There's things like Valley of the Saroos, March of the Dribcots, my favourite entry of the Globots.
Titles so bad, even 1960s Doctor Who didn't use them.
You do have to wonder a bit, because this was just after Quatermass being on as well, which took quite a realistic view of science fiction for once, and I've no doubt that Joe Meek was an avid viewer of the Quatermass series, because I think basically everyone who had a TV in the 50s it was all that was on. That and the Doc Green and some puppet falling over, probably.
Joe Meek, obviously, one of the few things I know about him is he died relatively young, and you said this album possibly pushed him towards that.
Well, I mean, there were a lot of things along the way. I mean, some of it is conjecture, some of it is absolute fact. I mean, there's various stories about that he was gay in the days when it was actually still illegal, and he's rumoured to have been blackmailed about it while he's having hit singles, and the stories that he became infatuated with young boys and some of the bands he was working with who reacted with absolute horror, and that pushed him further, and he made a lot of bad business deals, and he pretty much lost all his money. And also, a really major thing to point out is that there was a completely unfounded court case over Telstar, which it was suggested he'd ripped off from a French record, which it later turned out he couldn't possibly have heard. And it was after he died, it was thrown out of court. But unfortunately, shortly before that happened, it all got too much for him, and he went a bit strange, and he shot his landlady and then himself on the anniversary of Buddy Holly's death, which is also alleged to be significant. So it's quite a grim story, really. There's a lot of rock tragedies. There's kind of a humour angle, but it's just desperately sad, really. And he wasn't really appreciated enough in his lifetime, really, because producers weren't really the stars then. Famously, to cut a very long story short, when he died, he had a huge stack of tapes in what was his studio, which allegedly contain early recordings by people like David Bowie, Status Quo, who recorded for him, but he never managed to get any interest in them. But his lawyer was supposed to dispose of them, but couldn't bring himself to destroy all these tapes, so he sold them to a member of one of his bands. I think he may recently have been in talks with the British Sound Archive about donating them to them.
Right.
But for a long time, they were just sort of sitting in his house doing nothing. And, obviously, yourself that, it seems easier from the other side of the fence. People say, oh, why aren't you doing, 8 podcasts a week? And you think, because I have a life to live. But, I mean, it was a classic case of, this guy didn't have the time to do anything with the tapes, but the fans wanted the tapes to be heard. And there was once a protest outside his house led by Doc Cox. He was a huge Joe Meek fan.
Doc Cox, who used to be on That's Life.
Doc Cox used to be on That's Life, and other famous fans include Victor Lewis Smith, Mark Radcliffe,
and Nick Moran film quite recently.
Oh yes,
which I haven't seen. I think it was called Telstar.
It was called Telstar.
Yeah.
It's a very good film. It's not a fun film, as you might have gathered from the details.
It's not a fun story, really.
No,
is it?
Exactly. Yeah.
He's ginger.
Sorry?
Johnny Layton in Biggles. Plays Ginger. Boy's a big fan.
Jeff, come here. Excuse me, girls, ladies. Take the speaker, point out that window towards the backyards. All the other windows are soundproofed. And I'll need that as well. Drop dead, you silly old fucker! Oh. All right, you can close the window and put the speaker back now. There's the love.
Is he coming down?
Can you talk to her? I'm far too busy right now.
Yes, it's best you crack on.
And it's worth seeing, but not one to watch just before bed. Although brilliantly, it has Ralph Little playing Chaz from Chaz and Dave, who was Joe Meek's regular
Peter
session
Hook
bassist.
and Chaz. He's done the musical greats now in film, hasn't he? Not Chaz from Morph, of course. We don't want another
So
lawsuit.
if we're doing the Elastica biopic, is he going to play Annie?
I have to watch these people like a hawk.